What would you do if the very ground beneath your feet held secrets darker than death itself? In 1847, on a cotton plantation in Georgia, a young enslaved man named Elias was buried alive as punishment for defying his masters. But what he brought back from that night of terror would unleash something far more horrifying than anyone could imagine. If you're ready for a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what you're about to hear will change how you see justice forever. The morning mist clung to the red Georgia clay like a shroud as the sun struggled to break through the canopy of ancient oaks surrounding Blackwood Plantation. It was October 1847, and the cotton fields stretched endlessly under a sky that seemed perpetually grey, as if the heavens themselves mourned what transpired on this cursed land. The air carried the scent of wood smoke from the slave quarters, mixed with the earthy smell of freshly turned soil and the lingering sweetness of cotton blossoms that had long since given way to the harsh reality of harvest season. Elias Washington, though he bore the surname only because the law demanded enslaved people carry their master's name, knelt in the dirt beside the main house, his calloused hands working methodically to repair a broken wagon wheel. At 23, he possessed an intelligence that made the white overseers uncomfortable and a quiet dignity that infuriated them even more. His mother had taught him to read in secret, using a worn Bible she'd hidden beneath the floorboards of their cabin, and his father had passed down stories of their homeland across the ocean, stories that kept alive the memory of freedom in a place where such memories were dangerous. The plantation bell had rung at dawn, as it did every morning, calling the enslaved community to another day of backbreaking labor. But this morning felt different. There was a tension in the air that even the animals seemed to sense. The horses were skittish in their stalls, the dogs whined and paced restlessly, and the crows that usually filled the oak trees with their raucous calls had fallen strangely silent. "Boy," the voice cracked like a whip across the morning air. Elias didn't flinch. He'd learned long ago that showing fear only fed their hunger for dominance. Slowly he raised his dark eyes to meet the pale, cruel gaze of Thomas Blackwood, Jr., the plantation owner's eldest son. Thomas was a man of 28 who had inherited his father's cruelty but lacked his cunning, making him unpredictable and dangerous in ways that even seasoned overseers found unsettling. "Yes, sir?" Elias's voice was steady, controlled, though his heart had begun to beat faster. Something in Thomas's expression, a mixture of satisfaction and barely contained rage, warned him that this was no ordinary summons. Thomas stepped closer, his polished boots clicking against the wooden porch. Behind him stood his father, Colonel Marcus Blackwood, a man whose reputation for cruelty had spread throughout 3 counties. The colonel's weathered face bore the permanent scowl of someone who viewed human beings as nothing more than livestock, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had built his fortune on the suffering of others. Flanking them were the plantation's 2 head overseers, Jake Morrison and Pete Williams, men whose brutality was legendary, even in a region where violence against enslaved people was commonplace. "We had visitors last night," Thomas said, circling Elias like a predator sizing up its prey. "Men asking questions about our operations, specifically about the northern route through Miller's Creek." Elias continued working on the wheel, though his heart began to race. Miller's Creek was where he'd been meeting with conductors from the Underground Railroad, helping other enslaved people find their way to freedom. The meetings were always conducted in absolute secrecy, under cover of darkness, with elaborate precautions to avoid detection. But how could they know? Who could have betrayed them? The Underground Railroad had become increasingly active in the region, much to the fury of plantation owners who saw their human property disappearing into the night. Just last month, 3 people from the neighboring Hartwell plantation had vanished, and the week before that, an entire family had disappeared from the Morrison place. The white community was on edge, suspicious of every shadow, every whispered conversation among the enslaved population. "I don't know nothing about no visitors, sir," Elias replied, his voice betraying nothing of the turmoil in his mind. He had perfected this mask of ignorance over the years, understanding that appearing too intelligent or aware could be as dangerous as any act of open rebellion. Colonel Blackwood stepped forward, his grey eyes cold as winter steel. "Don't lie to me, boy. Someone's been feeding information to those abolitionists. Someone who knows this land well enough to guide people through the back trails. Someone who can read and write well enough to send messages north." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Around them, other enslaved people had stopped their morning tasks, sensing the danger that crackled between the white men and Elias. Sarah, an older woman who worked in the main house and had raised Elias after his mother's death, caught his eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head, a warning that came too late. The colonel had been investigating the Underground Railroad activities for months, growing increasingly frustrated as more of his human property vanished into the night. He had questioned overseers, searched cabins, and even hired slave catchers to patrol the borders of his land. But the escapes continued, and his rage had been building like pressure in a steam engine, ready to explode at the first sign of a target. "Search his quarters," the colonel commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Two overseers, Jake Morrison and Pete Williams, rushed toward the slave quarters, a row of cramped wooden cabins that housed nearly 40 people, in conditions that would have been considered inhumane for livestock. The cabins were deliberately built without privacy, with thin walls and gaps that allowed overseers to monitor conversations and activities. Within minutes, they returned carrying a small leather pouch, their faces grim with satisfaction. "Found this hidden under his mattress," Morrison announced, his yellowed teeth visible in a cruel grin. Morrison was a man who took particular pleasure in the suffering of others, and the anticipation of what was to come had brought a flush of excitement to his weathered cheeks. Thomas opened the pouch and pulled out several items with theatrical slowness, ensuring that everyone present could see the evidence being revealed. There was a hand-drawn map of the local area, with certain paths marked in red ink, a letter written in careful script and addressed to someone in Philadelphia, and most damning of all, a small metal compass that gleamed in the morning sunlight. "Well, well," Thomas said, his voice dripping with false surprise. "What do we have here? A map showing safe routes north, a letter to northern sympathizers detailing our security measures, and a compass to guide runaway slaves through the wilderness. Looks like our boy Elias has been quite busy." Elias's blood ran cold as he stared at the items. He'd never seen them before in his life, but he recognized the handwriting on the letter. It was a crude imitation of his own careful script, close enough to fool a casual observer, but clearly forged by someone who knew his writing well. Someone had planted these items with meticulous care, ensuring that the evidence would be convincing enough to seal his fate. His eyes swept the gathered crowd and stopped on the face of Marcus, another enslaved man who'd always resented Elias's ability to read and write. Marcus had been passed over for the more privileged position of house servant that Elias sometimes filled, and his jealousy had festered for years. Marcus quickly looked away, but not before Elias caught the flash of guilt in his expression, mixed with a satisfaction that made his stomach turn. "Those ain't mine," Elias said firmly, though he knew the futility of his protest. "I never seen them things before in my life. Someone's trying to frame me." Colonel Blackwood backhanded him across the face with such force that Elias stumbled backward, his vision exploding in stars. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth and he felt his lips split against his teeth. The blow had been calculated not just to cause pain, but to demonstrate the absolute power the colonel held over every person on his plantation. "Don't add lying to your crimes, boy," the colonel snarled, his voice rising with each word. "The evidence speaks for itself. You've been caught red-handed and no amount of denial will save you now." "Please, sir," Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling with fear and desperation. She had watched Elias grow from a frightened child into a man of quiet strength, and the thought of losing him was more than she could bear. "Elias is a good boy. He wouldn't do nothing to hurt nobody. He's been working hard, keeping his head down, never causing no trouble." "Silence!" Thomas roared, his face flushing red with anger. "Anyone who speaks for this traitor will join him in punishment. Is that what you want, old woman? To share his fate?" The threat was clear and immediate. Sarah stepped back, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her mouth to stifle her sobs. She'd raised Elias after his mother died of fever when he was 12, and watching him face this false accusation was tearing her apart. But she also knew that speaking further would only make things worse for both of them. Around them, the other enslaved people watched in horrified silence, understanding that they were witnessing something that would change all their lives. The children clung to their mother's skirts, sensing the danger even if they didn't understand its source. The men stood with clenched fists and downcast eyes, knowing that any show of support for Elias would be seen as evidence of their own guilt. "You've betrayed not just this plantation, but every white family in this county," Colonel Blackwood continued, his voice rising with righteous indignation. "You've put our women and children at risk by helping murderers and thieves escape justice. You've violated the sacred trust between master and slave, and for that, there can be no forgiveness." Elias wanted to laugh at the bitter irony. These men spoke of murderers and thieves while standing on land built with stolen labor and watered with the blood of countless innocent people. They talked of sacred trust while holding human beings in bondage, separating families, and treating people like property to be bought and sold. But he held his tongue, knowing that any response would only make his situation worse. The morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the plantation grounds and illuminating the faces of the crowd with pitiless clarity. In the distance, the cotton fields stretched toward the horizon, their white bowls ready for harvest, a harvest that would be gathered by hands that would never see a penny of profit from their labor. "The punishment for treason," the colonel announced, his voice carrying across the plantation grounds like a death knell, "is death. But death would be too merciful for what you've done. Death would make you a martyr to your cause, and we cannot allow that." A murmur of fear rippled through the crowd of enslaved people. Even the white overseers shifted uncomfortably, sensing that their employer was about to cross a line that even they found disturbing. Colonel Blackwood was known for his creative cruelties, but something in his tone suggested he was about to surpass even his own reputation for brutality. "You will be buried alive," the colonel declared, savoring each word like a fine wine. "Up to your neck, so you can contemplate your sins while the earth claims you slowly. If God sees fit to spare your miserable life through the night, perhaps he has use for you yet. If not," he shrugged with casual indifference as if discussing the weather. The pronouncement hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. Several women gasped, and one of the younger men stepped forward as if to protest before being quickly pulled back by his companions. The punishment was so cruel, so inhumane, that even hardened overseers looked away in discomfort. "No," Sarah whispered, the word barely audible above the sound of wind through the oak trees. "Please, God, no." But the colonel had already turned away, dismissing Elias's fate as easily as he might order the slaughter of a pig for dinner. The decision had been made, and nothing in heaven or earth would change it now. As the sun climbed higher in the October sky, casting long shadows across the plantation grounds, Elias was dragged toward the old cemetery at the edge of the property. It was a place where enslaved people had been buried for generations, their graves marked only by simple wooden crosses that had long since rotted away, leaving no trace of the lives that had ended there. The irony wasn't lost on him. He would be buried among his ancestors. But unlike them, he might live to see another dawn. The question was, would he want to? The old cemetery lay at the furthest edge of Blackwood Plantation, where the cultivated fields gave way to wild forest that seemed to stretch endlessly into the Georgia wilderness. Ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss created a natural cathedral, their gnarled branches reaching toward heaven like the arms of the long-dead souls buried beneath their shade. The air here was different, thicker, heavier, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of one's neck stand on end. It was here, among the unmarked graves of generations of enslaved people, that Colonel Blackwood had chosen to carry out his twisted punishment. The cemetery itself told the story of the plantation's dark history. Scattered throughout the area were small depressions in the earth, where graves had settled over time, and occasionally a piece of rotted wood would surface after heavy rains, the remains of crude coffins that had long since surrendered to the elements. No headstones marked these resting places, no flowers adorned the graves. The dead here had been forgotten by the world above, their names lost to history, their stories untold. By mid-afternoon, word of Elias's fate had spread throughout the plantation and beyond. White families from neighboring properties had arrived to witness what they called justice being served, their carriages forming a semicircle around the burial site, like spectators at some macabre theatre. The women sat in their finest dresses, fanning themselves against the October heat, while their husbands stood in small groups, discussing the event with the casual air of men attending a horse race. Among the white spectators was Judge Cornelius Hampton, a man whose courtroom had seen countless enslaved people sentenced to death or brutal punishment. He nodded approvingly at Colonel Blackwood's choice of punishment, seeing it as a creative solution to the growing problem of slave rebellions. Beside him stood Reverend Josiah Mills, whose Sunday sermons regularly included biblical justifications for slavery, and who now murmured prayers for the salvation of the savage soul about to be buried. The enslaved community watched in horrified silence, knowing that any protest would result in their own punishment. They had been forced to witness this spectacle as a warning, a reminder of what happened to those who dared to dream of freedom. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, their young minds struggling to comprehend the cruelty they were witnessing. The adults stood with downcast eyes, their faces masks of enforced submission that hid the rage and sorrow burning in their hearts. Elias stood at the edge of a freshly dug hole, his hands bound behind his back with rough hemp rope that had already begun to chafe his wrists raw. The pit had been precisely measured, 6 feet deep, and just wide enough to accommodate his body, with the depth calculated to bury him up to his neck, while still allowing him to breathe. The soil that had been excavated lay in neat piles around the hole, dark and rich with the decomposed remains of those who had been buried here before. The digging had been done by other enslaved men, forced to prepare the grave of their friend and fellow sufferer. Each shovelful of earth had been a betrayal they were powerless to refuse, and the weight of their complicity hung heavy on their shoulders. They had worked in silence, their faces streaked with tears they dared not shed openly, knowing that their own families would suffer if they showed any sign of resistance. "Any last words, boy?" Thomas Blackwood asked, his voice carrying a mockery of solemnity that made several of the enslaved witnesses flinch. He was enjoying this moment, savoring the absolute power he held over another human being's life and death. Elias looked out at the faces surrounding him, taking in the scene with a clarity that surprised him. He saw fear in the eyes of his fellow enslaved people, cruel satisfaction in the faces of the white spectators, and something else, something that made his blood run cold. In the shadows at the edge of the cemetery, partially obscured by the hanging moss and twisted branches, he glimpsed figures that seemed to shimmer and fade when he tried to focus on them. They were people, old people, young people, children, all watching with eyes that held depths of sorrow he couldn't fathom. Their clothing was from different eras, some wearing the rough homespun of field hands, others dressed in the faded finery of house servants. Some bore the marks of violence, rope burns around their necks, scars from whips, wounds that had never healed. They stood in silent witness, these spirits of the dead, waiting for something that Elias couldn't yet understand. "I forgive you," Elias said quietly, his words carrying clearly in the still air. "All of you, because you don't know what you're doing. You think you're punishing me, but you're only damning yourselves." The simple statement sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Several of the white women shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and even some of the overseers looked away. There was something in Elias's tone, not defiance, not fear, but a strange kind of peace that made everyone present feel suddenly small and ashamed. It was as if he could see something they couldn't, as if he possessed knowledge that elevated him above his circumstances. Judge Hampton frowned, disturbed by the dignity with which Elias faced his punishment. This was not how condemned slaves were supposed to behave. They were supposed to beg, to grovel, to provide a satisfying display of submission that would reinforce the natural order of things. Instead, Elias stood like a man preparing for a sacred ritual, his calm acceptance more unsettling than any amount of screaming or pleading would have been. "Get him in the ground," Colonel Blackwood ordered, his voice harsher than before. The boy's composure was beginning to unnerve him, And he wanted this business finished before it could affect the morale of the other slaves. Jake Morrison and Pete Williams grabbed Elias by the arms and forced him down into the pit. The earth was cold and damp against his body, and he could smell the rich, loamy scent of soil that had been nourished by decades of decomposing bodies. As they began to shovel dirt around him, Elias closed his eyes and tried to find that place of inner calm his mother had taught him about before she died. "Remember, baby," she had whispered during her final fever-racked days, her voice barely audible above the sound of her labored breathing. "No matter what they do to your body, they can't touch your soul unless you let them. Keep your spirit free, and you'll always be more than they can understand. The ancestors are watching, and they'll guide you when the time comes." The dirt rose around his chest, then his shoulders, then his neck. Each shovelful felt like a small death, cutting him off from the world above ground and connecting him to the earth in a way that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Soon, only his head remained above ground, and even that was barely visible among the scattered leaves and forest debris that covered the cemetery floor. The physical sensation was overwhelming, the weight of the earth pressing against his body, the restriction of his breathing, the complete immobilization of his limbs. But worse than the physical discomfort was the psychological impact of being buried alive, of feeling the earth claim him, while his mind remained fully aware of what was happening. The crowd began to disperse as the sun started its descent toward the horizon, but not before Colonel Blackwood delivered his final words. He stood over the buried form of Elias, his shadow falling across the young man's face like a dark prophecy. "Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can betray the natural order," he announced, his voice carrying across the cemetery with the authority of absolute power. "This is what happens to those who forget their place, who dare to dream of equality with their betters. Let the earth judge whether this boy deserves to live or die." As the last of the spectators departed, their carriages rolling away into the gathering dusk, the cemetery fell silent except for the natural sounds of the forest. Owls began their evening calls, and somewhere in the underbrush, small animals rustled through the fallen leaves. The temperature dropped steadily as night approached, and soon Elias's breath was visible in small puffs of vapor that dissipated quickly in the cold air. But it wasn't the cold that made him shiver. As the hours passed and true darkness settled over the cemetery, Elias became aware that he wasn't truly alone. The shadowy figures he'd glimpsed earlier began to materialize more clearly in the moonlight, emerging from behind trees and rising from the very ground around him. They moved with the fluid grace of memories given form, and gradually he began to recognize some of them. There was old Tom, who had died 3 years ago after being worked to death during harvest season, his body finally giving out after 70 years of backbreaking labor. Mary, a young woman who had taken her own life, rather than submit to the overseer's advances, her spirit still bearing the marks of the rope she had used to escape her torment. Little Samuel, who had succumbed to fever the previous winter because the plantation's doctor refused to treat enslaved children, his small form still wearing the ragged clothes he had died in. They didn't speak with voices that could be heard with earthly ears, but somehow Elias could hear them in his mind, not words, but emotions, pain, anger, sorrow, and something else, a deep, abiding hunger for justice that death had not satisfied. They had been waiting, he realized, waiting for someone who could bridge the gap between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. "I see you," Elias whispered into the darkness, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the Spanish moss. "I see all of you, and I hear your pain." The temperature around him seemed to drop even further, and the very air began to thicken with an energy he couldn't name. The spirits drew closer, their forms becoming more solid and defined, until he could see the details of their faces, the expressions of hope and desperation that had followed them beyond death. As they gathered around him, images began to flood his mind, not his own memories, but theirs. He saw the true history of Blackwood Plantation, the midnight raids on African villages, the horror of the slave ships, where human beings were packed like cargo in conditions that killed half of them before they reached the New World, the countless acts of brutality that had been committed on this very land over the course of generations. He witnessed murders that had been covered up, rapes that had gone unpunished, and children torn from their mothers' arms and sold like cattle to distant plantations. He saw the systematic destruction of families, the deliberate crushing of spirits, and the calculated cruelty that had been used to maintain the system of slavery. But more than that, he saw something else, a darkness that went deeper than human cruelty. The land itself had been corrupted by generations of suffering, and that corruption had taken on a life of its own. It fed on pain and injustice, growing stronger with each act of violence committed on its soil, until it had become something almost sentient in its hunger for retribution. "They think they own this land," a voice whispered in his ear, old Tom's voice, though the man's lips didn't move. "But the land owns them now. It remembers everything. Every drop of blood spilled, every tear shed, every life stolen, and it's hungry for payment." As dawn approached, Elias felt something fundamental shift within him. The boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead had grown thin in this place of so much suffering, and he found himself straddling both worlds. He was still alive, still breathing, but he had been touched by something beyond mortal understanding. The spirits began to fade with the first light of dawn, but their presence remained with him like a second heartbeat. They had chosen him, he realized, to be their voice in the world of the living, their instrument of justice in a place where justice had been denied for far too long. When the sun finally crested the horizon, painting the cemetery in shades of gold and crimson, Elias was no longer the same man who had been buried the night before. He carried within him the memories and pain of generations, and with that burden came a terrible knowledge of what was to come. The spirits had shown him the future as well as the past, and he had seen the reckoning that was approaching Blackwood Plantation like a storm on the horizon. The dead would have their justice, and the living would finally pay the price for their crimes. As he heard the sound of approaching footsteps, the overseers coming to check if he had survived the night, Elias smiled grimly. They had buried him to break his spirit, but instead they had awakened something far more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. The dead were no longer silent, and their voices would not be ignored. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cemetery as Jake Morrison and Pete Williams approached the burial site, their boots crunching on the frost-covered leaves that carpeted the ground. Both men had slept poorly, haunted by dreams of accusing eyes and whispered voices they couldn't quite understand, but somehow felt in their bones. They had participated in many cruel punishments over the years, but something about the previous night felt different, wrong in a way that made their skin crawl and their hands shake as they reached for their morning whiskey. Morrison, a man of 45, who had spent his entire adult life brutalizing enslaved people, found himself jumping at shadows and starting at every sound. His wife had complained that he'd spent the night muttering in his sleep, speaking words in languages she didn't recognize. Williams, younger but no less cruel, had awakened to find his bedroom window open, despite being certain he'd locked it before retiring, and muddy footprints leading from the window to his bed that couldn't be explained. "Think he's still breathing?" Morrison asked, his voice hoarse from too much whiskey and too little sleep. There was an edge of nervousness in his tone that he couldn't quite suppress, a fear that had nothing to do with the possibility of finding a corpse and everything to do with the strange dreams that had plagued him through the night. Williams spat into the dirt, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "Don't matter much either way. Colonel wants him dug up and put back to work if he's alive, or thrown in the swamp if he ain't. Either way, we get this business finished and move on." But as they reached the burial site, both men stopped short, their faces draining of color. Elias was indeed alive, his dark eyes open and staring up at the sky with an intensity that made them both take an involuntary step backward. There was something different about those eyes. They seemed to hold depths that hadn't been there before, as if he had seen things no living person should witness. The pupils were dilated despite the bright morning light, and there was a quality to his gaze that made both overseers feel as if they were being judged by something far greater than a mere enslaved man. "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison muttered, crossing himself unconsciously. "Boy's tougher than he looks." But it wasn't just toughness that had allowed Elias to survive. There was something else, something that radiated from him like heat from a forge. The very air around the burial site seemed charged with electricity, and both men could feel the hair on their arms standing on end. The morning birds, which had been singing moments before, had fallen silent, and even the insects seemed to have ceased their buzzing. They began the process of digging Elias out, working in uncomfortable silence. As the dirt fell away from his body, they could see that the night had taken its toll. His lips were blue with cold, his skin was pale and waxy, and his breathing was shallow and labored. But he was undeniably alive, and more than that. He seemed somehow transformed by his ordeal. "Can you stand?" Williams asked gruffly as they pulled Elias from the pit, trying to mask his unease with brusque efficiency. Elias nodded slowly, though his legs shook as he struggled to his feet. The circulation was gradually returning to his limbs, bringing with it waves of painful tingling that made him gasp. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the weight of what he now carried in his mind. The memories and emotions of the dead, pressing against his consciousness like a dam about to burst. As he stood there, swaying slightly, Elias could see things that the overseers couldn't. The cemetery was alive with spirits, dozens of them, all watching the proceedings with expressions of grim satisfaction. They had accepted him as their champion, their voice in the world of the living, and he could feel their power flowing through him like electricity through copper wire. "Colonel wants to see you," Morrison said, cutting the ropes that bound Elias's hands with more force than necessary. "Don't try nothing stupid. You've used up all your luck for one lifetime." But even as he spoke the words, Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. There was something in Elias's presence that made him think of deep water and hidden currents, dangerous and unpredictable. The young man who had been buried the night before had been defiant, but ultimately powerless. The person who stood before them now radiated a quiet authority that made both overseers deeply uncomfortable. As they walked back toward the main house, Elias became aware of changes in his perception that went far beyond the lingering effects of his ordeal. He could see things that others couldn't, shadows that moved independently of their sources, faces in the windows of empty buildings, and, most disturbing of all, dark stains on the ground where acts of violence had been committed. The plantation looked different to his transformed vision. What had once appeared to be a prosperous agricultural enterprise now revealed itself as a place of accumulated horror. The very foundations of the buildings seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and the air itself felt thick with the weight of unresolved suffering. He could see the psychic residue of every act of cruelty that had been committed on this land, layer upon layer of pain and injustice that had soaked into the very soil. The main house, with its white columns and elegant facade, appeared to him now as a monument to hypocrisy. Behind its beautiful exterior, he could see the darkness that lurked within, the screams that had echoed through its halls, the tears that had been shed in its rooms, the lives that had been destroyed by the decisions made within its walls. Colonel Blackwood was waiting on the front porch of the main house, his face a mask of cold calculation. He had expected Elias to emerge from his punishment broken and compliant, ready to serve as an example to others who might consider defying the established order. Instead, he found himself facing a young man whose presence seemed to fill the space around him with an almost palpable tension. The colonel had built his fortune on his ability to read people, to understand their weaknesses and exploit them for his own benefit. But as he looked at Elias now, he found himself unable to penetrate the young man's composure. There was something in those dark eyes that made him think of still water hiding dangerous depths, and for the first time in many years, Marcus Blackwood felt a flutter of uncertainty. "So," the colonel said, his voice carefully controlled, "you survived your night with the dead. Perhaps God has decided you have some use after all." Elias met his gaze steadily, and for a moment the colonel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. There was something in those dark eyes that made him think of Judgment Day, of accounts being settled and debts being paid. It was a look that spoke of knowledge beyond mortal understanding, of secrets that could destroy everything he had built. "Yes, sir," Elias replied, his voice quiet but carrying an undertone that made everyone present shift uncomfortably. "I learned a great deal during my time in the ground." The words seemed to hang in the air like a threat, though Elias had spoken them with perfect respect. There was something in his tone that suggested hidden meanings, dangerous knowledge that could upset the carefully maintained balance of power on the plantation. "Did you now?" The colonel's tone was mocking, but there was an edge of uncertainty beneath it. "And what exactly did you learn during your educational experience?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, as if listening to voices only he could hear. Around them, the other enslaved people who had gathered to witness his return watched with a mixture of awe and fear. They could sense that something fundamental had changed in their friend, that he had been touched by forces beyond their understanding. When he finally spoke, his words sent a chill through everyone present, white and black alike. "I learned that this land remembers everything," he said softly, his voice carrying with perfect clarity despite its low volume. "Every drop of blood spilled, every tear shed, every life taken before its time. And I learned that the dead don't rest easy when justice has been denied." The colonel's face flushed red with anger, but beneath the rage there was something else, a flicker of fear that he couldn't quite suppress. "Enough of your superstitious nonsense. You'll return to your duties and speak no more of this foolishness, or you'll find yourself back in that hole, permanently this time." But even as he issued the threat, Colonel Blackwood felt a nagging unease. There was something different about the plantation that morning, a quality to the light, a stillness in the air that felt pregnant with possibility. And the way the other enslaved people looked at Elias, with a mixture of awe and fear, suggested that word of his survival had already spread and taken on a significance beyond the mere physical fact of his endurance. The house slaves who had gathered on the porch whispered among themselves in languages their masters didn't understand, speaking of signs and portents, of ancestors walking among the living, of justice delayed but not denied. The field hands who had witnessed the burial and now saw the return spoke in hushed tones of miracles and divine intervention, of a chosen one who would lead them to freedom. As Elias was led away to resume his work, he passed Sarah, who had been waiting anxiously near the kitchen. She reached out to touch his arm, and the moment her fingers made contact with his skin, she gasped and pulled back as if burned. The contact had lasted only a second, but in that brief moment she had felt the presence of something vast and terrible, something that spoke of justice and retribution. "Child," she whispered, her eyes wide with shock and recognition, "what happened to you out there?" Elias looked at her with infinite sadness, his eyes holding depths of sorrow that seemed to encompass the suffering of generations. "I saw them, Sarah. All of them. They're not gone. They're waiting." "Waiting for what?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "For the reckoning." Throughout that first day after his return, strange things began to happen around the plantation. Tools went missing and reappeared in impossible places. Hammers found hanging from tree branches 20 feet off the ground. Shovels discovered buried blade first in the middle of well-traveled paths. Animals became skittish and refused to enter certain areas, particularly the old cemetery and the area around the main house. The temperature seemed to drop without warning in specific locations, creating pockets of cold air that made people shiver, even in the warm October sun. Several people reported hearing voices calling their names when no one was around, and more than one person claimed to have seen figures moving in their peripheral vision that vanished when they turned to look directly. The house slaves reported that doors opened and closed by themselves, that candles extinguished without cause, and that shadows moved independently of the objects that cast them. The kitchen staff found their carefully prepared meals spoiled overnight, despite being stored in cool, dry places. The laundry women discovered that clothes they had washed and hung to dry were found the next morning stained with what appeared to be blood, though no source for the stains could be identified. But it was that evening, as the sun set over the cotton fields, that the first truly inexplicable event occurred. Thomas Blackwood was walking alone near the slave quarters, making his evening rounds to ensure that all was quiet and orderly, when he heard the sound of singing, a low, mournful spiritual that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The song was one he recognized, a funeral hymn that the enslaved people sang when one of their number died. But the voices singing it were not the voices of the living. They had a quality that made his blood run cold, a resonance that seemed to come from the earth itself. He followed the sound to its apparent source, and found himself standing at the edge of the old cemetery. But the cemetery was empty, and as he watched in growing horror, the singing gradually faded away, leaving only the whisper of wind through the Spanish moss and the distant sound of his own labored breathing. Thomas stood frozen at the edge of the burial ground, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The silence that followed the ghostly singing was somehow worse than the supernatural voices had been. It was the silence of something waiting, watching, preparing to strike. He could feel eyes upon him, though he saw no one, and the sensation made his skin crawl with a terror he had never experienced before. As he turned to flee back to the safety of the main house, Thomas caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision. When he spun around to look, he saw nothing but shadows and Spanish moss swaying in the evening breeze. But for just a moment, he could have sworn he saw figures standing among the graves, dozens of them all staring at him with expressions of cold judgment. That night, Thomas Blackwood did not sleep well, and he was not alone in his restlessness. The return of Elias had awakened something that had been slumbering beneath the surface of Blackwood Plantation for generations. The boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead had been breached, and through that breach, justice long denied was finally beginning to seep through like water through a cracked dam. In the slave quarters, the community gathered in hushed circles, speaking in whispers about what they had witnessed. The older people, those who remembered the stories passed down from their grandparents, nodded knowingly as they recognized the signs. The ancestors were stirring, they said, awakened by the suffering of one of their own and ready to demand payment for generations of unpaid debts. Elias himself sat apart from the others, his back against the wall of his cabin, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. The spirits surrounded him constantly now, an invisible congregation of the wronged and the murdered, sharing their memories and their pain. He could feel their hunger for justice, like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders, and he knew that what had begun with his burial was only the first movement in a symphony of retribution that would shake the very foundations of the plantation. The dead had chosen him as their instrument, and he would not fail them. The reckoning had begun, and before it was finished, every debt would be paid in full. 3 weeks had passed since Elias's return from the grave, and Blackwood Plantation had become a place where the living walked in constant fear of the dead. What had begun as isolated incidents, strange sounds, missing objects, unexplained cold spots, had escalated into a reign of supernatural terror that left everyone on the property looking over their shoulders and jumping at shadows that moved independently of their sources. The plantation's daily routines had been disrupted by a series of increasingly disturbing events that defied rational explanation. Livestock died overnight without apparent cause, their bodies found arranged in perfect circles around the old cemetery. Crops withered in geometric patterns that spelled out words in languages no one could read, but everyone somehow understood. Words of judgment, condemnation, and promised retribution. The enslaved community, while still forced to maintain the appearance of normalcy, moved through their tasks with a new sense of purpose and barely concealed anticipation. They could feel the change in the air, the gathering storm of justice that had been building for generations. Children who had never known anything but bondage began to speak of freedom as if it were a tangible thing they could reach out and touch. The first to truly suffer was Jake Morrison, the overseer who had taken particular pleasure in burying Elias alive. It started with nightmares, vivid dreams of being pursued through endless cotton fields by figures whose faces he couldn't quite see, but somehow recognized with a terror that went beyond rational fear. These weren't the faces of strangers, but of people he had brutalized over the years, people whose names he had never bothered to learn, but whose suffering he had orchestrated with methodical cruelty. In these dreams, Morrison found himself running through a landscape that shifted and changed around him, where the familiar paths of the plantation became twisted mazes that led nowhere but deeper into darkness. The pursuing figures never spoke, but their presence filled him with a dread so profound that he would wake screaming, his sheets soaked with sweat that smelled of grave dirt and decay. But the nightmares were only the beginning. Morrison began to experience waking visions that were far worse than any dream. He would be walking through the plantation, conducting his normal duties, when suddenly the world around him would shift. The living enslaved people would be replaced by the spirits of those who had died under his watch, their bodies bearing the marks of the violence he had inflicted upon them. They didn't threaten him, or even acknowledge his presence directly. Instead, they simply went about their ghostly business, working in the fields with wounds that never healed, carrying burdens that had killed them in life, tending to children who had died of neglect and starvation. The sight of their continued suffering, even in death, filled Morrison with a guilt so overwhelming that he began to drink heavily, trying to drown out the visions that haunted his every waking moment. Then came the voices. At first, Morrison dismissed them as the product of too much whiskey and too little sleep. But as the days passed, the whispers became impossible to ignore. They followed him everywhere, accusations spoken in languages he didn't understand but somehow comprehended perfectly. The voices of the dead, calling him to account for his crimes, demanding justice for the lives he had destroyed. The whispers came from everywhere and nowhere, from the wind in the trees, from the creaking of floorboards, from the very walls of his house. They spoke of specific incidents, naming victims he had forgotten, describing acts of cruelty he had committed without a second thought. They knew everything, remembered everything, and they would not let him forget. Pete Williams fared no better. He began to see faces in every reflective surface, not his own face, but the faces of people he had brutalized over the years. They stared at him with eyes full of pain and accusation, their mouths moving in silent words that he could read all too clearly. Why? Why did you hurt us? Why did you take our children? Why did you break our bodies and our spirits for the crime of being born with dark skin? The faces appeared in mirrors, in windows, in the surface of water, even in the polished metal of his belt buckle. William stopped shaving because he couldn't bear to look in mirrors, stopped eating because every piece of food tasted like grave dirt, and stopped sleeping because the dreams that came were worse than any waking nightmare. He began to see the plantation as it truly was, not a prosperous agricultural enterprise, but a factory of human misery built on stolen lives and watered with tears. Every building seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Every field seemed to whisper with the voices of those who had died working its soil. The very air felt thick with the accumulated suffering of generations, and Williams found himself struggling to breathe, as if the weight of his crimes was literally crushing the life out of him. But it was Colonel Marcus Blackwood who bore the brunt of the supernatural assault. As the architect of the plantation's cruelties, and the man ultimately responsible for generations of suffering, he found himself the primary target of forces beyond his understanding or control. The spirits that had been awakened by Elias's ordeal seemed to recognize him as the source of their torment, and they focused their attention on him with an intensity that was both terrifying and relentless. It began with the discovery of his study in chaos one morning. Books scattered across the floor, papers torn to shreds, and furniture overturned as if by some tremendous force. But it was the message written across his desk that truly unnerved him. The dead demand justice count spelled out in what appeared to be blood that was still wet despite the room having been locked all night. The smell was the worst part, the sickly sweet odor of decomposition that seemed to emanate from the very walls of his home. It was the smell of death, of bodies left to rot in unmarked graves, of lives cut short by cruelty and indifference. The odor followed him everywhere, clinging to his clothes, his hair, his skin, until he could taste it with every breath. Colonel Blackwood hired servants to clean the study, but the message reappeared every morning, written in the same mysterious substance that defied all attempts to identify or remove it. He had the room sealed, but the smell continued to permeate the house. He moved to different quarters, but the supernatural manifestations followed him wherever he went. "Father," Thomas said, finding the colonel standing in the ruins of his study for the third time that week, "we need to do something about this. The workers are terrified, the overseers are talking about leaving, and the neighboring plantations are starting to ask questions. People are saying we're cursed." Colonel Blackwood turned to face his son, and Thomas was shocked by what he saw. In just 3 weeks, his father seemed to have aged a decade. His hair had gone completely grey. Deep lines had etched themselves around his eyes, and there was a haunted quality to his gaze that spoke of sleepless nights and constant fear. The man who had once commanded absolute authority over hundreds of people now jumped at shadows and started at every unexpected sound. "Do something!" The colonel laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and broken. "What would you have me do, boy? Call in the preacher to perform an exorcism? Hire a witch doctor to cast out demons? This is the 19th century, not the Dark Ages." But even as he spoke the words, Colonel Blackwood knew that conventional solutions would not address their current crisis. Whatever was happening at Blackwood Plantation existed outside the realm of rational explanation, and it was growing stronger with each passing day. The very foundations of his world were crumbling, and he was powerless to stop it. The neighboring plantations had indeed begun to take notice. Strange lights were seen dancing over Blackwood's fields at night, and the sound of singing, mournful spirituals sung by voices that seemed to come from the earth itself, could be heard for miles around. Travelers reported that their horses refused to pass by the plantation gates, and even the most hardened slave catchers spoke in whispers about the haunted place where the dead walked among the living. The enslaved community, meanwhile, watched these developments with a mixture of fear and grim satisfaction. They had lived with the reality of supernatural beliefs their entire lives, understanding that the world contained forces beyond the physical realm. Unlike their white oppressors, they were not surprised by the manifestation of otherworldly justice. They had been expecting it for generations. Their African ancestors had brought with them knowledge of the spirit world, understanding that the dead did not simply disappear, but continued to exist in a realm that intersected with the world of the living. They knew that great injustices created disturbances in the spiritual realm, and that eventually the balance would be restored through divine intervention. Elias had become a figure of almost mythical significance among them. He moved through his daily tasks with an otherworldly calm, seemingly unaffected by the chaos swirling around him. But those who looked closely could see the toll his transformation had taken. He rarely spoke, ate little, and his eyes held a depth of sorrow that seemed to encompass the suffering of ages. "He's carrying them all,